we're going to shift gears here a little bit, talk about documentation, but documentation then ultimately leads to sometimes deficiencies when internal or external inspections happen. So Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you here. We've talked a lot about risk assessment and how we define what those risks are and those significant risks. But what about the part of risk assessment where we conclude that there isn't a reasonable risk of a material misstatement? So the risk assessment procedure may be the only procedure we perform around that, account balance or class of transactions or something. How much documentation do we need to put in the file to support that professional judgment, and is it clear to the auditor what they need to document in that circumstance?
I think this is a really excellent question, and I would say that it's something that it's a balancing act that we spend more and more attention to debating as time goes by. Because, as I mentioned just now, there are an infinite amount of risks that one can consider when assessing, risks to an organization. But we as auditors, have to hone in on those risks that can manifest itself into the financial statements. So we do have a lot of debates about this, and the fact of the matter is we aren't just responsible for our risk assessment conclusions, that ultimately we have risks that we've responded to appropriately, but on our process for getting to those conclusions and the basis for our judgment of saying, why and how we decided a particular risk did not require an audit response. So, we're continuing to emphasize to teams the areas in which that this is important because, some areas are pretty clear cut and dry where it's a little bit obvious, cash or payables or expenses. It didn't take a lot of auditor judgment to conclude here are my risks of material misstatement. But naturally, there are other areas where a lot of careful consideration is needed, whether that's over revenue or inventory, or if you're a bank on the allowance for loan and lease losses, a significant unusual transaction like a business combination. Those naturally involve more auditor judgment for defining what your risks are that have a risk of material misstatement, and you have to do a good job of explaining in your audit documentation when you decided something wasn't a risk that required a response. So we always say, document all your close calls. Anything that you as a team spent time with and you ultimately decided that risk does not require a response. Whether that's a risk that's inherent to the industry or the account, and you say ultimately that risk doesn't impact this particular client, go ahead and document the basis for that conclusion.
Great. Anybody want to add to
I would just say oftentimes when teams go through risk assessment, they get to low risk, maybe very low risk, but they don't necessarily mean no risk. So low risk means you have to think about whether you've done enough work substantively, and you have to think about whether the management team and we have identified any other work that needs to be done on the internal control side to cover off key assertions. So I do think that helping, what do you mean no risk? What do you mean by no? And really, and oftentimes they mean low risk. And there might be some response required, and those are some of the issues that sometimes we get into perhaps later than we'd like to.
Yeah. And I think often, Maria, that some response is what the team's really trying to get after. They're trying to say, well, within the framework of what I know, if I took this account balance, which is an industry often has inherent risk, but I know at this entity I'm in this low risk area, I think I've done enough work, but I'm struggling to take the evidence I've obtained and put it into a bucket of further audit response. Or I'm struggling to look at the controls and not end up doing 12 controls over this very, very low risk. And that then causes the team to say, well, is it a very, very low risk, or is it actually no risk?
Right.
So I'm convinced if we wanted risk assessment to be as powerful as it needs to be, we're going to have to be able to articulate variation of response. And it's going to have to be quite different to the historic lens of doing more or less samples and having thresholds on substantive procedures that are narrower or broader in the work we do. There's something in that we're going to have to work out as a profession, and it's a great opportunity for the academic community to help. So what is audit evidence, and how does it present itself in a very different way when you've got this low risk we're worried about?
Right. And I do think the risk assessment standards would allow for this variability you're talking about. So it's not so much the standards as
examples. It's helping You know,
Right.
what is that variation?
Right.